Josh, please start us out today.
All right, so we're going to skip the company introductions and all that, just go straight into the ideas. It's a fairly quick presentation, and we're hoping there'll be plenty of room for discussion afterwards. So, getting started. There's been a lot of study on the concept of complexity over the last several years. Has anybody actually read any of the complexity articles and the studies? Okay. So this talk is about studies of complexity and how that actually is likely to affect information security. There's not a lot of research out there yet about complexity in information security except for the research Nate's done. So we're going to be bouncing this presentation back and forth between us as we go. Brief overview. The idea behind complexity is that of having small parts that interact together. Everybody knows who Stephen Wolfram is? Everybody? Okay. So the concept, his discovery from cellular automata and the emergent behavior from those sorts of things are what sort of started driving this field. One of the ideas behind complexity is that it's non-reducible. So if anybody here has a classic education in science, like, I've got a physics degree, I know we've got other physics people in the room, the core idea, the thing you're taught in classic science is to reduce what you're reading and what you're understanding to the smallest possible components. And the idea is, if the smallest possible components interact with other smallest possible components in ways that are nonlinear, non-Euclidean, you can get interesting behavior, interesting effects that may not be as directly extrapolatable, to make up a word, as you might expect. There's also, and I discovered this in electronics, I don't know if anybody else is, I assume we all have a fair number of electronics here, the concept of hysteresis. Anybody not know hysteresis? Oh, everybody knows it. We'll skip it. Okay. So, we have networks. In a network, you have a node. A node can be considered a part in this concept. So when you have a bunch of nodes together, a bunch of parts interacting, the sorts of emergent behavior we see in networks, we see arc storms, we see worms, we see hitting packet count limits, this sort of odd behavior. When people say the network is behaving strangely, it may be emergent behavior, it may be something that's not understood. You don't really know until you start diving in. We see this with systems. Each application, library, service can be considered a part. You can get dependency issues, you can configuration drift. Those are things we use to describe this sort of behavior that happens as these parts start to interact with one another. And in code, you can consider each function as a part. Code creep, you get flaws in functions. You have problems that start to appear the more complex the code becomes. And this problem was difficult with functional programming. It gets much worse with object-oriented programming. And I don't know if anybody has studied how it affects aspect-oriented programming, but indications are that the more abstract you get, the more likely emergent behavior is going to be a problem. We also, at the same time of having this complexity coming out of our systems and coming out of our technology, we have complexity coming out of the social world in which we live. We are living in a world of unequal investment. I forget who it was yesterday that mentioned we're a bunch of rich white guys talking about rich white guy problems. Thank you. This is more of that, okay? But the fact is, we're living in a world in which a lot of people have the majority, a small number of people have the majority of the resources. Most of the world is left out. But that pattern, that unequal distribution, applies wherever you happen to look. If you look within the rich people community, you see that same sort of pattern, where the top tier of the rich people have the majority of the resources. That happens in the attacker space too. And this is a model I've put together. It's a very loose model. Feel free to challenge me on it. I can't really defend it. It's just what I've observed. But I see basically 3 tiers of attackers. And I find it useful, 4 tiers. And I find it useful to think of them in this way There are all sorts of ways to carve up the space, but if I carve it up this way, it sort of makes sense from a resource distribution perspective. Tier 1 is what I call background radiation. This is, you plug into the internet, things start to happen. You know, you're probably not going to be targeted, brand new IP, brand new space. It's just the background radiation of what's going on. This tends to be the people that are apt to collect a lot of systems, build a botnet, and use them later. Tier 2, these are the vertical focused people. These are the people running malware cartels and operating in a campaign-based structure. Tier 3 is industry focused. These are people looking to steal intellectual property and basically win within the market. And Tier 4 is targeted attacks, what vendors like to call APT. The idea here is to steal intellectual property in progress as it's being developed for direct head-to-head competition and long-term gain. At the Tier 1 level, the background radiation level, basic AV and patching, works. People say AV's dead, but the fact is you plug a machine without AV on to the internet, you're going to be popped sooner than one with it. The problem is AV's dead beyond Tier 1. If you're in a Tier 2, you need something like anti-malware, whitelisting, sandboxing, and this is where things get interesting at an economic level. Because if you are in Tier 2, remember this is vertical focused, so suppose you're in the pharmaceutical vertical. Anybody who is at the upper end in defenses within that vertical has disproportionate competitive advantage against the ones that aren't. Because if you have a tier of attackers that are running in cartel mode, running in campaign structure, when the campaign ends, they're done. Which means everybody they've popped within the scope of that campaign has been taken over. Everybody they haven't is still there. And that is what provides that separation within that vertical. So within the Tier 2 world, you need vigilance. You need to be aware that security tends to weaken over time because people are lazy. And be aware of this deflection effect, because the deflection effect will have long-term effects over time. Tier 3, this is the industry-focused stuff, looking at intellectual property, not just looking straight at resources. And this is where monitoring and operational practices become critical. That's what makes a distinguisher if you're defending against a Tier 3 adversary. This is where automation starts to come in. Can automation be useful defending against lower tier attackers? Of course it can. But because it's not a point of competitive advantage at that point, that's why a lot of companies don't invest in the automation world. I think of this as automation allowing companies to move faster and faster and faster. And it's like bacteria focusing on a species. Okay? An attacker that is focusing specifically on an industry, unlike a campaign that's going to end in 6 weeks or 6 months. These are people whose lives are spent understanding the ins and outs of a particular branch of manufacturing. Okay? Their skills are aimed there like a bacteria is aimed at a particular species. And the fight between attack and defense is like antibiotic resistance. Research and development must keep up, must be willing to pivot on ideas that work and ideas that don't in order to maintain their defensive structure. And then finally, Tier 4. What I typically say is there's really no standard advice for Tier 4. That's head-to-head competition, one attacker group against one company, and anything goes. Okay? The attacker likely knows the network better than the defender does because they have more time. The defenders work 8 to 5, go home at night. The attackers, get disproportionate results for the time they put in, so they put more time in. Attacks will be customized, defense will be too. The problem is, greater success creates greater investment. Within each one of these 4 tiers, the more successful somebody is, the more resources they have to put into the next generation of attacks. This means over time, resources leak from defenders to attackers and up the chain to the attackers at the top. This is the same sort of 1% economics we see in the normal American economy. It's just applied to the attacker space. At the same time, as defenders, we've been increasingly aiming for monoculture. That's what regulations, that's what standards do. It makes things standardized across the space, which makes it easier and easier for the attackers to knock us down. So the law of complexity as it applies here is it's ever harder to defend against attack, and it's ever easier for the attackers to attack identical targets. We also have unequal law enforcement. In the US, our hands are often tied. There's an ethical belief that it is unethical to hack back. Now, there are people like John Strand out there trying to change that belief, but it is still a common belief. Law enforcement, as was discussed at least at our table last night, simply will not prosecute the small stuff. And what small means is changing drastically. Yes?
That depends on which agency.
Right.
It also depends on the economic number that, as an example, FBI have for your particular area, which is real interesting. And they have to actually show a cluster. If you don't have a large enough amount, you have to show a whole industry and get that together to hand to them, and then they'll make the decision. But
And also their skill set. Last I heard, FBI was backed up by doing forensic work, 7 months, some ridiculous.
Yeah, the last one I worked on with the FBI, they were backed up 1.5 years.
Yeah,
And
this
it's
was
like,
years ago. So
all right.
Do they do that internally still, or do they outsource?
My information's a few years old. Somebody here probably has more
they
information on
need
how.
other
In
contractors.
Germany, they have to outsource everything because there is no internal resources at all.
And that does include states and local.
Anything else? Okay. So, because of the limitations in the US in prosecution, a lot of attacker groups are located overseas. This is similar in other Western cultures. In non-Western cultures, there's a more communal view of intellectual property. There's a more communal view of ownership in general. And people are more easily swayed by local power and bribery. I can go off on a complete separate tangent on poaching of endangered species, but it's the same thing we deal with. You know, if you are in an environment where you're at the bottom end of that income distribution, it doesn't take much to bribe you. And if it doesn't take much to bribe you, it's easy to shift the power structure. So these areas are good places to shelter attack groups. You know, we see attack groups, you know, in Asia, in Eastern Europe, and in Africa. And as those areas become more technologized with better, you know, connectivity and things like that, we're going to see more and more of that. This allows the attackers to centralize ownership and spin up sacrificial groups where and when they wish. And sacrificial groups is an important concept because it's another small part. It's a small part in the attacker space. If they can spin up a group somewhere, they can launch attacks, and that group is within reach of, you know, U.S. law enforcement. Then when they get taken over, it's like, okay, we'll just spin up another group. And they're just constantly leeching that money out of those groups and centralizing it where it cannot be gotten, again, for resource centralization.
The FBI actually calls that tokenization.
Well, that's not confusing at all.
Yeah, well, they're a token group,
Right.
oftentimes spun up in order to give the courts and prosecutors something to focus on and keep them tied up and away from the real criminals.
Yep.
Very common strategy. And in Operation Aikido Year 3, we tracked a lot of that back to we developed language patterns, even to look for Craigslist ads. They were using the same set of Craigslist ads to recruit these token groups, which would be arrested within 2 weeks.
Yep.
And fed to a prosecutor to keep them busy.
Which gets us into arms race. Now, we've all talked about the arms race metaphor for years. Basically, we have this pattern where an attacker studies an environment and tries stuff. And the things that succeed are the ones that are eventually won. And the attackers can then gang up and use their knowledge to become more complex. And they get the emergent behavior out of the attacker space, making evolutionary leaps in attacks. And the defenders have to follow suit. So the attackers, in trying, what we've seen, they started outside. Now we're seeing a lot of inside attacks, and the defense is becoming more complex to deal with this. So attacks like spam, malvertising, social engineering, we're seeing a lot of that now. Defense is driving evolution of vendors. And when vendors compete on feature lists. Why do vendors compete on feature lists? Because people buy on feature lists, which means you have all of this money in the vendor space being devoted to building features that don't actually solve the problem, because the defensive vendors are competing against each other, not against the attackers. The attackers, in turn, have been focusing on making lightweight, easy tools to bypass detection. The advantages for the attackers are compounding, and winners are more likely to keep winning. The advantages are monetized. The money is then flowing into the next cycle or the next generation of these tools, and the defenders are being forced to move slower and slower. Because as technology gets more expensive, there's a longer vendor vetting process. Budgets, as we saw in 2008, get cut, and training gets cut. They're the first things to go. So on top of that, well, not exactly on top of that, as a result of that, when the defenders start to lose more, the government step in and say, we can't lose this much. Here are more laws, here's more regulation, here's more institutional process, which slows things down even further. So not only are we losing, but we're losing faster every day. So that's where we stand today. We have an ever-changing environment where friends and enemies are changing overnight. And because the attackers are changing so quickly, if you plan too far ahead, you're going to waste your resources. But if you don't plan far enough ahead, you're going to be unprepared. The solution is to aim not just to win, but to survive. And that's really what our talk is about survival. You need to identify these sorts of development cycles that vendors are going through, that your defensive technology is going through, and if you can, identify them for the attackers. Look at technology refreshes, look at new hires, look at mergers and acquisitions. Those are good indicators for what's going on. And store up enough resources to survive if things go wrong, but bet enough resources to win and to gain if things go right. That's that knife's edge we have to walk on. Okay, and I think that's here.
So, we've now heard about how things are now. And Josh painted us that really rosy picture.
Thank you, Josh.
We're doomed.
Well, we're also in the middle of a shifting landscape, and we heard a lot about this yesterday. One of the things, we're switching to mobile and mobile computing. Everybody probably has a smartphone in the room. I'm sure a lot of people have data plans that are one of the prime ways they access the internet. In fact, we had the wonderful example earlier. So we now have a sleep monitor we can put on our smartphone. It now interfaces with our fire alarm, and we have all these interactions coming from our always-on ubiquitous computing device that is our smartphone. But we also heard yesterday we have the Internet of Things, which is very rapidly growing from, say, what we saw 10 years ago. Electrical grids, home automation systems, cars, toasters, refrigerators. I figure if we think of a device right now, somebody's probably put either Z-Wave or Zigbee in it and hooked it up to the internet. Rule 34 on that one. But this has created a shifting landscape. We're now going to deal with more and more interactions between more and more digital devices that are all connected via the global internet. And so that's created this sort of tipping point in network complexity. These interactions are going to cause more complex behavior and more interesting complex behaviors. Again, we saw a great example yesterday. Just having these two apps for REM sleep and your fire alarm on your phone, we now have this new interesting complex interaction where we can screw up REM sleep. Think about doing that if you targeted a certain part of a corporation that had these. Maybe this is the part of the corporation you're going to want to spearfish suddenly. Doesn't matter what sort of social engineering training they had. They're working on practically zero sleep for a few days. They're going to be more likely to fall for your phishing attack, which will then allow you to do yet more things. And we have, with these attacks, these new complex structures of interconnections that are just going to lead to more and new and interesting emergent behaviors that we haven't really predicted or thought of yet. We also have an increase in globalization caused by ubiquitous computing and the internet. Internet crime is a global phenomenon. And we sort of talked about this earlier with unequal law enforcement, but these global actors all have different focuses too. So for example, Eastern European hackers, they tend to be focused a lot more on PII. We don't really see them trying to do money scams. We never hear about princes from Ukraine or princes from Romania with money in bank accounts. They're not usually the ones hacking and performing corporate espionage. We have 419 scams from Nigeria. They're the ones who primarily do a lot of this social fraud. But we don't usually see them hacking into companies and stealing IP, or hacking into consumer machines stealing PII. And then we have East Asia, which predominantly works with corporate espionage, attempting to hack in, steal IP. They're usually less worried about stealing personal information of users unless it allows them a stepping point into a further attack. And of course, this also creates interesting social complexities because of different global ethics. Of course, we mentioned this a little bit earlier. Different countries have different intellectual property views. Different countries have different views on copyright and what they consider private versus public information. And so what we might think is ethically wrong here, they might not think is ethically wrong there. And this creates interesting differences that we have to deal with in how interactions are mediated. Because we can't just assume certain interactions won't occur because we wouldn't do it. There's other societies, other cultures that potentially have different ethical views than we do. And of course, we also talked about this earlier. Again, we have complexities in the interaction of international law enforcement. A lot of times, if something happens in Romania, if the US law enforcement agency is trying to track information back, it's very, very difficult. And especially since, say, international law enforcement is funded even worse than our national law enforcement, and they're also primarily targeted usually towards specific internet criminal activities such as child trafficking and child pornography.
So the FBI has a permanent office in Romania.
Really?
Yes.
Interesting. We also have something, because we mentioned earlier these arms races and this tit for tat that we go through with attackers and defenders, we had the Red Queen. And for those, are there anyone who's not familiar with the Red Queen hypothesis here? Okay. So the Red Queen hypothesis came about in predator-prey environments and parasitic environments, and it had to deal with parasites living off the host, causing certain changes in the host, if I recall, the host's sexual reproduction, which would help benefit the parasite. Now, the sort of more general form of this is the Red Queen environment has come to stand as the hypothesis for any predator-prey environment where each population, the predator and the prey, have to evolve at almost the same pace. And these evolutionary jumps that each of these populations are taking aren't getting them necessarily ahead. Nobody is going to win. The old phrase coming from Alice in Wonderland is that they're all running as fast as they can just to stay in place. And that is what creates this tit-for-tat situation that we discussed earlier with arms races. Thankfully, it's well studied, and some of the field that has looked into this is the field of complexity science. And this was something that I ended up doing a lot of my research on. And my research was particularly focused on how can we do risk assessments or potential risk measurements or effect measurements of some of these very complex attacks. And usually, many times, if it involves large numbers of people and a very large network, we have to revert to modeling. And also this ties into our talk yesterday about the topology language. Having a central sort of language for discussing and describing the structures of our model goes us a long way in these sort of reproducible results and being able to create accurate models of these complex security phenomena. Now, some of the methodologies that exist to be able to do this include agent-based modeling, where we start taking all those little bits and parts of our structures. Each of those are potentially autonomous agents with specific defined behavior. And then we basically run that model out with those agents interacting with each other based on that behavior, and we see what happens. And we start running this model a large number of times, and this gives us sort of groupings of outcomes. The upside is we can start looking at groupings of these outcomes. The downside is because of the way complexity works, we couldn't say, given a specific initial condition, we couldn't say, well, this is exactly how it's going to come out. Because any little tiny mess ups in this initial measurement will totally skew the end outcome of this. We also have some research out there by Russell Thomas, who's done a lot of work on malware development, attackers and defenders in the Red Queen. And we've seen some of the earlier work by Stephanie Forrest. For those who aren't familiar, she did a lot of interesting work looking at trying to create an immune system for the computer and look at if we had programs that sort of had this sense of self defined by their system calls, if we could use that identity of a program to try and detect when it was either acting in an aberrant manner or if potentially the program has been replaced. And something that's interesting as well is there's been some game theory work, for example, a paper called Flip It by Rivest, who it's worth looking up if you get a chance. And all these various different methodologies and models and practices will help us look into some of these problems that we've discussed so far and help us answer some of these open questions of, again, if our goal is to survive, one of the questions is, well, how can we meet that? And one of the ways we can do that is by looking at some of the tools of complexity science and trying to use those as best as we can to start looking at these potential future outcomes and try and choose the best one for our organization. And I will let Josh continue then discussing from evolution.
Okay. So, sorry, need a little water here. A quick clarification. When we talk about evolution, natural evolution is random. Okay? And animals will mutate. Whichever mutation survives wins. Most mutations are not beneficial and they will cause death. A lot of mutations have zero effect. That's not exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking about evolution as a metaphor, meaning change over time. Okay? In business, evolution's often random, okay, but it can be guided. And if it's guided in the wrong direction, it can result in failure. If it's guided in the right direction, it can survive. It can succeed over base randomness. Okay. If you're biologically trained, anybody here biologically trained other than me? Anybody? All right. It's only a metaphor, so we can move on from there. Evolution is iterative. There's constant improvement, and the concept of better is highly environmentally dependent. Okay? We like to think in business that the better company is the one that makes the most money, but it changes drastically. It's multidimensional, and it varies a lot on the environment. From an evolutionary perspective, there is no ultimate plan. There's no ultimate goal but survival. In markets, a win is profit, but a win is not all money. If you succeed and you get all of the money, you create a monopoly and other forces come after you in ways that are not straight economics. Okay, you get power structures, you get some pretty nasty, I think that, yes?
Sorry, just a quick one. You're saying the goal is survival. Is the goal in evolution and not actually to spread your genes, you know, to
Well, that depends.
become more dominant maybe?
The goal of a species is to survive, okay? And you can look at evolution in different ways, okay? At a genetic level, genetic evolution is these genes must spread further over these other genes. At a species level, it's this species must survive as a lineage against its competitors and against its attackers, right? But species, you know, bifurcate. You know, clade theory shows how all of that kind of stuff works. We can talk about the theory after if you want to pick it apart. But, you know, the core concept is that of survival. One of the most successful species on the planet right now is corn, because it's domesticated humans. Okay? So you can think of that as a mode of survival. In business, the idea is to survive, like a lot of people want the business to survive past them. That's one way to consider survival. Another way is I want to keep all the attackers at bay till I can retire. You know, that's another mode. But the idea here is to think about what survival means to you in a particular environment you're in. From an evolutionary perspective, you know, the metaphor I'm using today is a win is something that's good enough to survive the next cycle, the next iteration. So if you're in a startup, you know, a cycle could be a sprint. It could just be 2 weeks. We want to survive 2 weeks to get the next version out. If you make, I'm from Minneapolis, where there's a large medical company, and their cycles are 30 years, because it takes 30 years to get a new heart transplant device approved by the US government. So their survival is, we want to make sure we're still in business in 30 years when this new device comes out. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So evolution needs generations, and each generation builds upon the previous. Now, there are both flexible and inflexible advantages that species have, that businesses have. In a species, an inflexible advantage is that of DNA. Okay? DNA is simply not going to change much within the course of a single organism. You know, that organism's life, DNA is for the most part going to stay the same. You have flexible advantages like learning and epigenetics. I'm not getting into epigenetics here. That metaphor doesn't work quite as well. So upon this base of DNA and learning, you have each generation performing experiments. They can be random changes, but the successful ones will tweak the DNA or tweak the learning and pass that along. And the advantage goes to the next generation. The next generation of people, the next, you know, the interns that you come in, you train, they learn, they get better, hopefully better than you, so when you retire, they can be better. Same thing goes for products. Your product sucks. First generation product always sucks. But if you can iterate faster, it becomes better than what's out there. You know, you can look at Linux versus Microsoft. Version 1.0 of Linux kernel did not compare very favorably to some of the operating systems that were out there. But today, you know, it's the most common system used on servers, cloud servers, you know, hacker workstations. You know, we know what that means. In business, you have natural evolution, which is generational. The more change, the more rapid the improvement to the business. But since changes are more likely to be negative, you see a lot of business failures out there. You see businesses that fail because they make too many changes. You know, this is your standard cowboy CEO, comes in every week, different thing, read a different article in Newsweek and says, we're doing this now. Good way to kill a business. You also see ones with too few changes. More conservative businesses will have failure because they get outcompeted in the marketplace. You also see guided evolution. This is faster. This is technological improvement directed by intelligence. It's still evolution, it's just more guided. And the speed is based on the analysis of current flaws. Okay? You take a hard look at your own technology, a hard look at your own business, and say, we got to fix this, this, and this. We want to take these bets on where things are going so we can succeed. The faster you can develop is largely hampered by the complexity of the business or the tools with which you're working. This is why we're really seeing not much changing coming from some of the more complex technologies that are out there. Because there's just so much cruft. It's so hard to change if something gets so complex. It's one of the reasons why defensive technologies really slowed down and attacker technologies really sped up. Because the attackers are using these small little Unix-like tools that you can iterate on quickly. And the defenders have these large monolithic appliances, these large systems that they're trying to change, and that's why a lot of these vendors have gone to cloud services, because they can iterate faster in the cloud model than you can in an appliance model. And finally, you have automated adaptive response. This is very, very fast, but automated response requires metrics-based learning. You have to know ahead of time, is this change good or bad? You have to define what good and bad means before you measure, so when you measure and as you iteratively measure, you can make decisions from a responsive perspective without needing to do the analysis after the fact. Now, the flaw with this model is it highly optimizes for short term. Okay. The good news is short-term optimization, as has been shown with all organisms from bacteria to giraffes, works really well. Okay. We see this today in iterative chip design, polymorphic code malware, lots of examples you can point to, and hopefully a lot more in the future. The fundamental question for you, do you want to play the long game or the short game? Long game builds value over time. From a personal level, you build skills, take them from job to job to job, you get better with each cycle. It's slow, but there is a high potential for reward. There's also a high risk if you fail. If you bet and say the entire world is going to be running IBM OS 2, that's where I'm going to focus my skill set, you might have problems later. Short game's different. You find a lit niche, you improve within that niche. There are a lot of people who've made their careers from focusing on, we want to help this business get from 100 people to 1,000 people. And when business gets too big, they go on to the next one. We do that again and again and again. We see this in attackers with people that, I only do PCI. When a business becomes PCI compliant, they move on. Or they only assess for PCI compliance. Okay? This is fast. You get a lot of small payoffs. There's low risk of failure because you can always assume there'll be a business in need for your skills, or if you're running a business, a market for what that business needs to offer. The important thing to remember, these are both valid approaches. There's nothing wrong with either one. There are people who change jobs every year, they're fine. There are people who stay forever, they're fine too. You have to fail fast, okay? Whether you're playing the slow game or the fast game, you have to fail fast because that's where learning comes from. The attackers are in tier 3 or tier 4, where you're getting hammered by these interesting things coming in. Your defenses have to fail quickly so you can respond quickly. Otherwise, if you fail slow, if you don't notice the failure fast enough, they'll be in and out, and you're never going to know. So if you're a defender in a target industry or high net worth, really look at that. Fail fast also results in quicker generations. And really the only way to win in this model is the automated adaptive response. Identify critical measurements, predetermined responses where possible and execute quickly. Be deliberate wherever you can, and where you cannot be deliberate, be responsive. Avoid being reactive, because if you're reactive, the attacker can anticipate what you're going to do and force a reaction from you. And that's how they win. That's how social engineering works. Is this you? Yep. Okay.
So the other thing we're going to have to look for now with future attackers and some of these future attacks that we're going to have to rapidly adapt to is emergent behavior. And basically what emergent behavior is behavior that is novel or very hard to predict based on the behavior of the individual agents or elements that have brought it about. So one of the examples is if we think about if we looked at a bunch of individual protons and how they interact, would we have been able to predict that putting them together forms, say, a table? Probably not. And we see this emergent behavior as well with a lot of other systems. Ants, ant colonies. You look at individual ants, you wouldn't really be able to predict there's a colony, but suddenly the colony is now this living organism, and the ants are really just individual, unique parts to that. Economic markets, the outcomes of economic markets end up being emergent outcomes. Basically, all these players interact in a way that causes these prices to rise and fall in the market in sometimes very unpredictable means. Weather patterns, this has sort of been a traditional area of sort of emergent behavior research, this idea of climate changing effects and how can we predict those with all these little individual elements that somehow come together to determine temperature, wind patterns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, these are everywhere right now in the physical world, and they're starting to show up more and more in the digital world with all these new interactions. And when it comes to business, the problem is these emergent behaviors cause a lot more uncertainties because of their difficulty in predictiveness. It's very hard for a business to try and forecast out some of these emergent behaviors, partly because of the novelty of them. And they can also cause some very big gains and losses. Usually the effects of emergent behavior follow, for those who are familiar with the sort of black swan metaphor, for better or for worse. Usually emergent behaviors can have these outcomes that have some very low probability but very, very, very disproportionately high effect size outcomes. And in technology, we sort of mentioned this a little bit earlier when we were talking about arc storms and worms, sometimes the spread of botnets. A lot of this is also spread due to emergent behavior, these interactions of various independent parties, either clicking yes or no on that spam email that you have that installs the malware for the bot. Something that we can also think about is sort of resiliency in our organizations. And the idea here is if we can reduce the complexity that we're going to see from these emergent behaviors that we're going to see out in the networks, the businesses can increase their certainty. We have sort of less difficult to predict behavior. The downside is usually resiliency requires many layers, sort of defense in depth sort of style thinking, and a greater level of resources usually are spent. And what happens then is when you build up these layers, you're reducing your ability to respond to an outcome, and you're reducing the speed of change, because now you're going to have to change all these layers of resiliency when you want to move direction and pivot. Now, of course, the problem here then is you're going to be outcompeted by competitors who aren't potentially as resilient, but they're faster and sloppier. We also could say increase analysis as a form of resiliency and try and sort of predict some of these outcomes. Now, there's sort of a trade-off here as well. A lot of it, as we sort of mentioned earlier when we were discussing models, it can be a bit of guesswork. And guesswork means you can guess wrong, and if you guess wrong, you're potentially going to be wasting resources there. Or potentially on the bigger end, you might have a false set of basis assumptions when you're trying to do some predicting analysis. And that could cause a much greater loss of resources in the outcome. However, really, as we look forward, we're going to have to sort of weigh these two methods for resiliency, and at least from a business organization, the only answer is to choose a form of resiliency that works well for that organization, so that you can assume that there will be some failure at some time, some sort of unpredicted emergent behavior that will potentially hurt you. However, if you can quickly rebound from that and iterate, say by training employees who are smart, self-directed, and empowered, potentially split apart the systems in your network with very clear boundaries and document those boundaries and those connections so they can be very easily analyzed without having them so congealed together that you're just looking at a whole part and it's very difficult to figure out what in there does what. And start investing in
Disruptive.
How did you know I was going to start investing in technologies that are allowing you to gain information, and a lot of information, and some baseline measurements and metrics? Because the idea is all this information you're bringing in is what's going to allow you to start using some of this predictive and modeling power. Because to do any sort of predictive modeling power, you're going to have to work on data, and you're going to have to work on as high a quality of base assumptions as you possibly can. And this is going to be important because we're going to start seeing some new and interesting threats. We're going to start seeing some hybrid attacks. And I sort of mentioned this earlier a little bit, this idea of now sort of combining physical and digital attacks. Start having digital attacks affecting our physical lives. And they're going to have intelligent aspects. Start thinking about what would happen, say, if we had a botnet that somebody actually attempted to try and put at least some weak artificial intelligence in for its spread. So now let's think of a botnet like an ant colony. Maybe each bot now is performing some independent decisions that it thinks will potentially improve the botnet itself. What about now we'll start combining a desktop SCADA phone botnet. And based on the locations, if say certain devices in the botnet phone-wise somehow come within range of the SCADA service, assuming the SCADA service has some sort of wireless connectivity, things can happen that way. And this idea that we'll now have botnets and attacks that are being able to leverage not only the information they gather in the digital world, but information they can gather from these sensor devices that we have as they move around in the physical world. And so really what we've talked about so far through most of this talk is an idea that all of these forms of complexity and the evolution that we're going to push forward in attackers is going to lead to these sorts of hybrid attacks. It's really just a matter of time until the attackers decide that they need to spend the resources. Once we push them to make that, to have them evolve one step more, we're going to start seeing more and more and more of these. And so really one way that we can mitigate or attempt to, well, mitigate the damage caused by these hybrid attacks, I don't think we will ever necessarily be able to avoid them completely because, of course, the complexity aspect of them will make them potentially difficult to predict. What we can do is try and have some means of intelligent change in our organizations to reduce the outcome effect of being hit by a hybrid attack. And so intelligent change is sort of a third tier above this idea of, say, first evolutionary change, where our business is just randomly reacting to the stimulus of the competitive market. And that's sort of what we do right now. They're reactionary to every outcome in the market and trying to adapt. There's some plan change where they look at their past reactions, some of their past failures, and try and predict where they will end up, say, in 10, 15, 20 years' time. That's still somewhat reactive based on former failures in the organization. One thing we're trying to put forward here is this notion of intelligent change. This idea that you can put in some resiliency to protect yourself in the case of losses, and you can start modeling some of your current situations, potential outcomes, to protect yourself against future losses again, but also help move the direction of the company towards a more winning position in the marketplace. So you don't even have to necessarily worry about the same amount of losses as you would previously. So instead of mitigating them, you're just completely avoiding. But to also do this, you need to increase the speed of the business cycle and to start predicting where you're going instead of reacting to where you've been. And this is where we're going to have to start moving businesses in the next 5, 10, 15 years as attackers start becoming more and more advanced. And to end with Josh, to summarize up what we were sort of aiming for today.
So to reiterate the points that we've made, if you plan too far ahead, you waste resources. If you don't plan far enough, you're going to be unprepared. The solution is to not to aim to win, but to aim to survive. Identify the cycles you're working in. Look at technology refreshes, new hires, mergers and acquisitions. If you don't know what cycle you're in, those are good indicators to tell you how fast you're moving. Try to move faster if you can. Store enough resources to survive if things go wrong, and embed enough resources to survive if things go right. So that's the end. Ran a little longer than I planned. Sorry, Brian.
No, you're good.
So my information, Nate's information, we're online. So, questions, discussion?